I thought this was a propitious moment to remind people the history of Stalin and Russia and the old Soviet Union and Ukraine, literally 90 years ago. Stalin surrounded the Ukraine, starved those people. Millions and millions of them died in horrific ways. And it comes to mind because of what Putin is doing now to the Ukrainians, something very similar. He's surrounding their cities, he's bombarding them, he's cutting off routes for food and medicine and other necessities. You have a massive refugee movement taking place. 10% of the population of Ukraine has already crossed the border into Eastern European countries or is doing so as I speak. We have no idea what the casualty numbers are, but they must be immense. They must be immense. And I have to tell you something. I'm embarrassed. That's the word. I'm embarrassed by the Biden administration and the failure to support these people to the extent they could have before Putin invaded and since. And I hear some of these so-called experts on cable TV and in their columns and so forth saying MiGs wouldn't have made the difference. As they sit at home in their warm homes, telling us that MiGs wouldn't make the difference, while the Ukrainians have been begging for MiGs, I suspect that the Ukrainians know what they want and what they need. They could have taken out that 40-mile-long convoy of tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they weren't able to. They have 50 jets in their entire Air Force. They were going to get 20 or 30 more, and Joe Biden pulled the plug. Just like he did on Harpoon missiles that they had requested in December, before Putin invaded, but they knew he would, in order to protect themselves against the Russian Navy in the Black Sea up through the Crimea and so forth. And they've been pulverizing their port cities. These people need our support. They need our help. Reagan would not have blinked like this. Trump would not have blinked like this. How do we know? He told us. But Reagan would confront the Soviet Union all over the world. He confronted them in our hemisphere, in Nicaragua and elsewhere. He confronted them in Angola. He confronted them in Europe. And he confronted them, of course, in Afghanistan. Not with American infantry, but with American equipment and know-how and support. And that's what we owe the Ukrainian people. What does this have to do with us? It has everything to do with us. This thing bleeds over into NATO. It triggers a war with us. I've already said this is the beginning of World War III. The question is whether we can contain it or not. And I'm not going to keep going over what I've said repeatedly, but the idea that Ukraine is not allowed to win, Ukraine is not allowed to have a stalemate because it might upset Putin. He keeps waving around the threat of nuclear weapons is appalling. It's provocative. Putin is the kind of dictator where he sees weakness, he acts. That's why he moved into Ukraine in the first place. He saw Biden, he saw Afghanistan, he saw what they did with the pipeline and all the rest. So he moved. Xi's watching now. Iran's already fired missiles towards our consulate in Iraq. They don't seem to be nervous about anything. Gee, I wonder why. And of course, a little rocket man over there is firing missiles left and right. He's got a brand new shiny ICBM he wants to show off in the next few days or weeks. These are treacherous times, very treacherous times. But I want to remind you, I've talked about it in the past, of the slaughter of the Ukrainians 90 years ago. 1932, 1933, in a horrific genocide of starvation. You see, Stalin wanted these peasant farmers, who've been peasant farmers for centuries in the Ukraine, to give up their farms to the communal, to this communist system. Well, the communist system was starving people to death, including in Russia and other parts of the what would be now the Soviet Union. And Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, quite frankly, whether it's wheat or corn and what have you. And they were self-sufficient. And these peasants weren't about to give up their land. So what did he do? He starved them. He cut them off at sea. He cut them off on all the on all the borders, and he starved them to death. And there are horrific stories of cannibalism and such things. People just falling in the streets and dying. And as I say, in horrible ways. And of course, the New York Times, their Johnny-on-the-spot reporter was Walter Duranty. He was based in Moscow, and he was feeding the American people propaganda that was fed to him by Stalin. And you can see some of that in the United States today. in some newspapers, on some websites, on some TV broadcasts, pretty much people regurgitating the line from Putin. Putin views himself as Stalin. He views himself as Catherine the Great, in a different way. And he's very much interested in taking these lands back because from his perspective, which is, of course, insane, these are all Russian lands. These are not separate countries. This is all the greater Russia. He's not even thinking about the old Soviet construct. He's thinking about pre-Soviet construct. These are Russian lands. There is no separate Ukraine or Crimea or all the rest of it. And here we are literally 90 years later. And these same people are being slaughtered. They're being starved. Their cities are being attacked by Vladimir Putin, who views himself as a Stalin figure. That these are Russian lands and so forth. Whatever his psychological issues and his distortion of history, this is going on. The Holodomor, you see, 1932, and here we are, 2022. History will remember this. History will remember those who spoke out in defense of the Ukrainian people, and will remember those who did not, particularly those who spoke out in defense early on and even continuing to this day in one form or another for Vladimir Putin. History will remember Joe Biden as a failed leader, not just of the United States, but of international statesmen, for failing to give the Ukrainians what they said they needed, MiGs, Harpoon missiles in December, and other forms of weaponry to defend themselves and protect themselves. The full extent of the slaughter and the casualties taking place are unknown as I speak, but it's going to be horrific. It's just a matter of time. For those who are in a position like me, who have a public platform, you have a responsibility to be responsible. You have a responsibility to inform your audiences of the history of this region and what is taking place today. And while many are talking about the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian people, and by God, they are heroic, it's not enough. They say we should pray. Let's pray. Many people prayed who perished during the Holodomor, and by the way, during the Holocaust that followed shortly thereafter. Prayer is important, but from my own perspective, God also gives us free will. Pray and fight. So when people say on television or on radio that they feel for these people, they feel for these families, that's not enough. They need our help. You have tiny European countries that are stepping up to the plate because they know what this kind of horror is like. They went through World War II. They went through the Cold War. Many of them were finally freed during the Reagan era, including Poland and Romania and Hungary and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Bosnia, Latvia, and they fear for what's to come. The problem with Putin is the problem with any genocidal dictator, whether they be Marxist or fascist or whatever their ideology or mindset, if any. When they see weakness, they move. People keep talking about, are we going to escalate? Are we going to escalate? The issue is deterrence. Are we going to deter them? Russia is our enemy. Communist China is our enemy. The Islamo-Nazi regime in Tehran is our enemy, among others. They have now formed an axis of evil. It is an axis where one supports the other, either openly or behind the scenes. If we don't contain this, because I believe this is World War III, if we don't contain this war now, and where it begins and ends in Ukraine, it will spread, not just to Taiwan, not just the Middle East, should Iran get nuclear missiles, and under this president they will, but beyond. So if you support peace, you don't want your kids to go to war, you should be looking from a different perspective than the isolationists, the Putin wing of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, and the incompetent, corrupt media in this country. Just saying you're for peace and non-intervention doesn't bring you peace or non-intervention. We should have learned this from World War II, if not World War I, but definitely World War II. So now you know more about what took place in Ukraine than you've known before. Unless, of course, you've studied this in the past, which most people have not. Once again, the Russians are destroying Ukraine and slaughtering their people. And once again, the world is not doing enough to help them.
Want to see more Mark Levin? Go to levintv.com and subscribe now.